So we've had 35 years roughly of the greatest economic growth in the most open system in the world, but it was never more than a geopolitical and a demographic moment in time. And this decade, it was always going to end. And it can be sped up, and we're seeing that now. The Ukraine war is speeding it up. The complete descent of China into narcissistic cult of personality, not narcissism, is speeding it up. And we are looking at the end of the world that we understand in probably the next 36 months. The Europeans have a lot less wiggle room on their demographics because they have a lot less land area per unit of population. They just have not been able to maintain a high birth rate because they don't have something that we would consider the suburbs. You pretty much have a relatively dense urban core, and then you've got the farms, and there's very little buffer zone in between where an up-and-coming family can raise kids and have a yard. And if everyone's living in a condo, your birth rate's going to be lower. Also, they started industrializing decades before the rest of the world, so they're just so much further along in this process. And a lot of what we would consider your traditional Western European countries, Italy, Germany, Belgium, their demographics turned terminal back in the 80s. There just weren't enough kids to carry it forward. Well, and if you fast forward that 40 years, it means that they're literally running out of 40-year-olds. So this is the decade that all of those countries age into mass obsolescence. And we really don't have an economic model that can allow national cohesion. And then there's another crop of European countries, the bulk of the Central Europeans, all the way from Estonia to Bulgaria, that actually have faster aging demographies, but from a slightly younger base. And they will follow in the decade to come. We're looking at a Europe in as soon as 2040 that is made up of really just Spain, the United Kingdom, France, and the Scandinavian countries. The rest of it will have aged into desolation. There's so much in flux right now. I think the best way to approach this is just kind of give you an idea of the scale of what's going on. In the post-Cold War environment, with the advent of hyperglobalization, it used to be in pre-World War II, everything was imperial. And if you had iron ore and steel and food and coal, you could try to make something of yourself. And if you weren't, you were probably a colony. But with globalization post-1945, you now only needed one of those things, and you could trade for the others. And the whole world started to industrialize and urbanize. As we urbanized, we moved into the cities, and people started taking manufacturing jobs, and that generated growth and specialization and education and health and all the other things that we associate with the modern world. But when you're on a farm, you have lots of kids because they're free labor. You move into the city, you have like 1.2. And so we have been in a stage of ever accelerating population crashes now in parts of the world for 75 years. In the post-Cold War environment, when the end of history happened, everything about globalization and the Cold War kicked into high gear, and the countries that had not embraced it yet did. And most of the economic growth we have experienced globally since 1990 has been about metabolizing assets and countries and populations and resources that were not involved before 1990. And that is roughly half of the world. And this is the story of the Brazilian agricultural explosion, or the Russian commodities explosion, or the Chinese manufacturing explosion. But it was all happening against the backdrop of that demographic collapse. When you stop having kids, at first you generate a lot of growth. Because if you're in your 20s and your 30s and you have no kids, you're not spending money on diapers and school. You're spending it on cars and condos. It's a lot more high octane. And you get the growth story we've seen in the developing world, especially in China. But when you then are in your 50s, where they are now, the growth stops because you've got everything that you need. And when you retire, it all stops completely. So what we're seeing now in the 2020s is a lot of the world has aged into this point where the growth story is over and the production story is over, and there isn't a story moving forward. I anticipate we're going to be seeing sort of an American friends and family program evolving. NAFTA is obviously the core of that, and the hard work for that is not only done, but one of the great achievements of the Trump administration, from my point of view, from a cultural point of view, is convincing the hard right that tends to be very anti-migrant that Mexico is part of the family. I think that is the most indelible long-term impact of the Trump administration that we should be happy about. Other countries are going to be invited or already have found a way in the door. So the Australians and the Colombians already have long-term trade deals with the United States that are only going to get stronger. And Japan is a country that realized what was going on, realized that the Americans were backing away from sponsoring the global economy, realized the American military was going to be less adventurous in the future. And they looked around and they realized that they have the world's oldest demographic structure already. They've been dealing with this for 30 years. And they really didn't want to be facing the Russians in Asia and the Chinese by themselves. So they went to the White House and basically sought terms, and Trump's terms were humiliating, to put it in a single word. They signed anyway. And then when Biden came in, the Japanese made it very clear they did not want to amend the terms. So the Japanese have successfully bought their way into the American inner circle. So they're going to come along for the ride. Whether or not the Brits join is up to them. They have to really figure out what Brexit means. I mean, it's been 6 years. It should be time already, but they're just not there yet. One of the great things about globalization is by having a single military superpower, the entire world was combined into a single economic zone. And the efficiencies and the economies of scale that we got from that are something that we've never had before in human history. So if you want to make this an American example, imagine what your economy would be like in your local state if you couldn't trade with the other 49 states. So Texas has all the energy that it needs, but it's not going to have the iron ore. Minnesota is going to have the iron ore, but it's not going to have electricity. Iowa is going to have the corn and the pigs, but it's not going to have access to a road network or a rail network. Now, play that across the entire planet. We've had a single unified economic space, more or less. And in the case of energy, that means that energy that is produced in Saudi Arabia can go anywhere in the world, or the Germans can import energy from anywhere in the world. And as long as we've been locked together in this single system, everyone has a vested interest in making sure there are no disruptions to the transport system. Because if you have an interruption, say, in the Strait of Malacca, people in Vancouver are going to feel the energy pressure from that. What the price cap that the Europeans are putting on the Russians is doing is hiving the Russians off from the global pricing and energy security system, and then breaking the Russian system into two pieces, one that trades west into the European space and one that trades east into the Asian space. Well, if that's the case, then countries are able to choose what they want, but they're going to become locked into some of those choices. So China's probably the best example here. They're going to have a very heavy exposure to that Asian flow. It certainly limits your options. I'd argue that the way you see it is probably broadly accurate. In the United States, when we talk about demography, we usually do mean it as a marketing scheme. You know, that you've got a number of people who are in this specific demographic group. They value these things. They're at this stage of their life. Therefore, these products make sense to them. And the group that we've constantly been talking about are the millennials and especially the baby boomers. But there's more to it than just what it means from a market point of view in the short term. Because if you to play the long term, I mean, the problem with demographics is that they're glacial. It takes a lifetime for someone to live a life. And we've known since the 60s that the baby boomers eventually were going to age into retirement, and that was going to change the system because instead of paying taxes, they're going to be drawing pensions. Well, on average, that happens in the fourth quarter of we're here. We've known this has been coming for 40 years, but no one's ready because it was always off in the future. Well, the baby boomers are not just an American population block. They exist in every advanced country. The difference between the American boomers and everyone else is that American boomers actually had children that we now know as the millennials. Now, we can talk trash about the millennials all day, and I really do enjoy doing that, but they've got something going for them that all of their cohorts around the world don't. They exist. And so we have a 10 to 20 year period of financial crunch as the boomer money goes away before the millennials are in their 50s and providing capital. And we've got a 20, that's like a 10-year break in the financial world. And we've got a 20-year break while we're waiting for the millennials' kids to grow up.